Welcome to Ideagen TV. Today, I am honored to have with us Admiral James Winnefeld, author of Sailing Upwind, a new, inspiring, powerful read. Admiral, welcome.
George, it's really great to be with you and to be on Ideagen. So thanks for having me today.
Well, it's our pleasure and privilege, Admiral, and thank you, first of all, for your service to our nation. We could not be more grateful.
Well, it's always was an honor. I had a wonderful career with a lot of wonderful men and women that I served with, and it's hard to believe that I did it for 37 years. But thank you.
Incredible. And that's a great segue, Admiral, to an introduction. Would you kindly introduce yourself to our audience, our global audience, the millions of people that will watch this interview on Ideagen TV, and maybe provide a journey, a roadmap, a background of how you got here?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, I grew up in a Navy family, so I moved around a lot as a kid. And during one of my later stops in high school, I was in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and we all look at our parents and see what they do for a living. And I saw these F-14s flying around the landing pattern at the Naval Air Station in Virginia Beach. I went, that looks like it might be a lot of fun. So I ended up going to Georgia Tech and got my Navy commission through the ROTC program, went to flight school. And then 37 years later, I woke up and I was finished with a career that I kind of divide into thirds. The first third of my career, I tend to call learning the machine, which was about learning to be a Navy fighter pilot, learning to land on aircraft carriers day and night, learning how to do air combat and the like. And during that time, I was a young junior officer. I was a Top Gun instructor for 3 years, and ultimately ended up learning that business fairly well, I guess. And then the middle part of my career, I call sort of leading inside the machine. You're still operating, you're still flying, you're doing whatever, but now commanding a fighter squadron, going to nuclear power school, getting into the track to command a nuclear powered aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. And then the last third was what I call sort of leading the entire machine, where I was fortunate enough to be selected for flag rank and worked in a number of interesting positions there, ultimately as the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, number 2 ranking military officer, from which, it's an amazing place to, handle resource allocation, policy, and also to take care and nurture and grow the wonderful people we have in the military. So that's sort of a career in a nutshell in thirds, but it was tremendously rewarding and a real privilege to serve.
Incredible. And again, we are deeply grateful at Ideagen for your service to the nation and to the planet, really, in all the roles you held to make sure that democracy is upheld and on and on. It's just awe-inspiring. And you've written a book titled Sailing Upwind. What an incredible title, by the way. It's apropos, of course, to Sailing Upwind. And so would you kindly give us a brief overview of what your book is? What inspired you to write Sailing Upwind?
Well, I left the Navy in 2015. And as I left, my father told me, you need to gather all the information, all the things that you've done during your career, because it's been an interesting career, and write it all down as an effort to maybe entertain a little bit, but mostly to try to help prepare another generation for their leadership roles. And I had other folks saying, hey, you've done a lot of really interesting things, so you ought to write a book. So I somewhat reluctantly started to do this, writing, sort of one chapter at a time when I'd be flying somewhere on an airliner, because I retired in 2015 and have been in business ever since. And so that's what came together. And it's a combination of memoir and presenting a leadership framework, because I believe that learning about leadership is about study, meaning reading. It's also about observation, observing other leaders, both good leaders and not so good leaders, and then actually running to the sound of the guns and doing leadership yourself. And so I felt that in the process of learning that, it's good to have a framework on which to hang your knowledge. And so I've developed a framework of, sort of 5 anchors, which is, leading yourself, leading people, leading organizations, leading execution, and leading change. And those appear as vignettes throughout the book on every third chapter. So it was a great joy to write, and I'm very pleased that it seems to be fairly popular at the moment. And more importantly, I just want to be able to give a younger generation, as my father pointed out, something to hang their knowledge on as they grow and learn in this lifelong journey of learning about leadership.
That's right. Lifelong journey of leadership. And so I believe, and I'm sure you do as well, that we all stand, like you mentioned your dad often already in this interview, we all stand on the shoulders of giants.
True.
Who are some of those giants, those leaders that you've looked up to in your life that have truly helped shape the man you are today?
Well, I would, as you alluded, I'd start with my father, who was a towering example of integrity and service, two things that he believed in very deeply. And, as a kid, you hear that and you don't necessarily understand it. But if you hear it often enough and you start to think about it, you go, okay, there's something to this integrity and service piece. And then I would say throughout my career, there are a host of people you've never heard of, but I learned from every single one of them. Mostly really good leaders, some not so good leaders, and you can learn from both of those. Um, One I would point out in particular, I had the wonderful opportunity to serve for 1 year as Colin Powell's aide de camp when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that was about enough time because you don't want to be an aide too long. But what a fantastic learning opportunity from a truly thoughtful, generous, and strategic thinker, and just a very impressive human being. I learned a lot about leadership from him. In fact, one of the most profound things he ever told me was very simple. We were riding around in the car one day, and he said, Sandy, the essence of leading people is holding them to the highest possible standards while you take the best possible care of them. And that seems so simple, but when you think about it, it's very profound. And that if you do one and not the other, it doesn't work. But if you do both of them at the same time, it's magic. And that stuck with me for a long time. So he had a big influence on me.
That's so incredible to hear. And I agree. Colin Powell was a giant and will always be a giant in leadership and integrity and all of the rest. So what an opportunity for you to have served as aide de camp to him for that pivotal year in your career. And that's a perfect segue, Sandy, to, in your opinion, what are a few of those most pivotal qualities that exemplify leaders in leadership?
Great question. I mentioned the 5 sort of anchors, and within each of those, there's 4 things that I like to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about 20 things to your audience today. They can read about them in the book. But I think that 2 of the most important to me that really enable and empower leaders on the personal side. The first one is humility, and there are a number of people out there who achieve leadership positions who don't have any humility, and it doesn't work very well for them. People see through that very, very quickly. And then there are people who know they need to be humble, but they really don't know how to do it. So you get this sort of false humility. And then I think the people that I've really respected in my life and career were those who had genuine humility. They really realized that this wasn't all about them, and that you can accomplish so much if you just have that genuine feeling of humility. So it's something I tried to emulate my whole career. And then the second thing was, I think, which almost sounds like it contradicts humility, but it doesn't really. And that is the ability to challenge assumptions and be bold in what you're doing. And I have a saying that I like that is, incredibly bright adults will work unbelievably long hours, perfecting fundamentally flawed concepts. And what you want to do as a bold leader is to challenge those concepts and see if they still work. And if they don't, to have the sort of guts to go out and try a different way, not just asking for more means, but actually doing something differently. So I think that combination of humility and willingness to be bold and challenge the assumptions can make for a very powerful leadership combination.
And you're so right. In the interviews and the thousands of interviews we've done on Ideagen TV over the years, it is striking to see the importance of humility within the concept and the construct of leadership. And so it can't really be taught. You can view it, you can emulate it, you can try, but some of it is innate, right? Is what you're saying. And it's a little bit complicated, but I'd like to pivot a bit as well to ask you a question regarding challenges, because clearly you've had a long career, an incredible career, but there must be at least a challenge that was particularly difficult for you. And if you could describe how you overcame that, I think that's a great way to look behind the curtain to see how you handled and how you evolved into your leadership roles.
Sure. Life is full of challenges, and a Navy career is no exception. So I had plenty of personal challenges, learning how to land an airplane on an aircraft carrier at night, or going through a very difficult nuclear power school. But I think your question really speaks more to an organizational or leadership challenge. So I'll just pluck one vignette out of my career. It was in the middle of my career when I was the commander of a fighter squadron. And we were doing our best to maintain readiness and be the best squadron we could be. And it was a particular year, I think it was 1994, when there was a budget challenge. Sound familiar? We're having one today as we talk about the debt ceiling, where we were told that they were taking our money away from us, our flying money away for 3 months. And I got a phone call from a very senior person that said, Winnefeld, make sure you show the pain on this. And I walked away from that saying, well, first of all, my job is not to show pain. My job is to take the money that the taxpayers give me to produce the most ready fighter squadron that I can produce. And by the way, if I go into my squadron and say, hey, we're supposed to show all this pain, how's that going to affect their morale? Woe is me, things are terrible. So I decided that we were going to turn this negative into a positive. And I think that's a very important leadership principle or trait, is to always try to turn a negative into a positive. So we did that. We took all of our airplanes apart, put them back together, doing corrosion control. We used the simulator much more than any other squadron at the time. We went in and visited museums where there were old airplanes. We did a lot of training. And then we set a goal for when we got our money back, that we were going to do something that no squadron had ever done, which was to, I don't want to get too technical, but fly a 50 sortie day, dropping live weapons. And people said, you're crazy. That's too dangerous after you haven't been flying for a long time. I said, no, we're going to be ready for this. And I challenged my people to step up to that. And boy, did they. And it was so successful that I almost ended up going back to the person who told me to show the pain and say, you ought to do this all the time, shutting down a squadron for 3 months so that, you can actually kind of reset and regroup. I didn't go that far, but the whole point was to turn a negative into a positive by trying to be creative and with a positive mindset rather than a show the pain mindset. I think there was a good lesson for me that I used the rest of my career.
What an incredible learning lesson to turn negatives into positives. Again, it seems simple to do that, but it takes leadership as well to strategically think through how to turn these negatives into a positive without completely disrupting an operation, right? So it's very, very interesting. I'd like to ask you as well, so on decision making, clearly leaders make decisions, and as they say, leaders lead. How, Sandy, do you approach difficult conversations and or decisions as a leader, and what strategies, more specifically, do you use to navigate those situations effectively?
Yeah, so difficult conversations, difficult decisions as a leader. I think two of the most difficult things that you're doing as a leader is, one, when you're trying to get the best possible team put together, that sometimes involves asking people to leave the team. And that's a very difficult conversation. It's a hard decision to make. And another one is when you're leading change. That's very difficult. So on the first one, I always found that if somebody was doing something that I would call a sin of commission, there was an integrity issue there, that's not a difficult conversation at all, right? You just say, I'm sorry, this is not what our organization does. It's time for you to leave. But if somebody's trying as hard as they can, they really want to do well, but they're just not making the grade. And in my old business, flying airplanes, when you're not making the grade, that can be very dangerous. So it's not just to keep somebody swimming along. You have to ask them to leave. And so I think you just have to do that kind of thing with as much compassion as you can, and to try to offer the person as much help as you can on the way out the door, to try to have another career path or what have you, but it's something you have to do as a leader. On the leading change side, I like to teach people, whenever you're trying to lead change, there's going to be people resisting that change, right? And so I talk about concentric circles of understanding or concentric circles of change. And there's a sort of a communication strategy in there where when you first reveal the change, the innermost circle is what I would call ignorance. It doesn't mean stupidity. It just means the person hasn't understood or been exposed to the new idea. And then there can be a circle called denial, where it's like, hey, why are you doing this? If it's not broke, don't fix it. You're just trying to make yourself look good. It's more work for me to learn this thing. All negative. And then there's sort of sometimes a circle called vicious compliance, where they go, okay, I know I got to do this, but I'm going to show you how stupid it is. And then there's a little further beyond that circle, people start to go, I'm one of the few people in this organization that are starting to understand this thing. So I'm actually going to start buying into it. But it's called well-intended misapplication. They don't quite have it yet. And then there's this sort of renewed discovery where somebody becomes an active practitioner, a champion, a culture-carrying mentor, that sort of thing. So I've believed that when I have a conversation with somebody about change, I want to know what circle they're in, because I will have a different conversation, a different tone of conversation, a different type of conversation with people in each circle. Some are teaching moments. Some might be short and exciting conversations, like get on the train here, pal. And some are conversations where I'm learning from the person I'm trying to change about what they're seeing. So there's a strategy in there in leading change that involves communicating with your people and making sure that they're brought along in the right way. So I hope that helps as an answer.
It does. And it's incredible to see the process, the leadership process that you employ and that you've created, really, to identify and to be able to address that, the obstacles to change, which can be difficult. You're absolutely right. And so we've talked about challenges. We've talked about difficult conversations. I'd like to ask you, what has been, Sandy, the most rewarding experience or experiences of your career? And which accomplishments are you most proud of?
In all candor, to become the vice chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, you must have done something right during the course of your career. But those are not the most rewarding things for me. The most rewarding experiences of my career is when the people or a person that I have led or trained or mentored succeeds at something challenging themselves. And it might be something inside my own organization where I try to teach an organization, hey, here's where we're going to take this thing, and you watch people, you let them execute, get out of the way, and they do it really well. That's very rewarding. But it's also rewarding when they're no longer part of your organization and they go off and they succeed. And it's particularly rewarding when they succeed doing it your way. In fact, when you hear them repeat something that you might have taught them. One of the really fun things that happened to me after I retired is I went and visited my daughter-in-law at her training squadron down in Pensacola, Florida. And I was walking around the squadron area there, and up on the wall they had posted the 6 operational excellence principles that I have espoused that are really good at keeping organizations, particularly organizations operating equipment, safe. And they were right there on the wall. And she didn't put them there. Somebody else put them there. And it was like, hey, wow, the message got through. Those are rewarding moments rather than personal individual successes that I might have had.
That is simply incredible. And so continual self-improvement, call it Kaizen, call it whatever you like. How do you, Admiral, approach the process of reflection and self-evaluation? And specifically, what strategies do you use to continuously improve and grow?
But I think there are a couple of things that I do that lead to an overall balance that I'll talk about in a second. One is it's all, as you sort of alluded in your question, it's about continuous learning, both deeply in your own profession and broadly, either adjacent to your profession or completely outside your profession, because there are so many things that other people are doing in the world that may not resemble what you're doing at all that you can learn from. and that you can actually apply to your own life in terms of how you conduct yourself, but also to the work that you do. And I really do believe that most of creativity is synergy, of taking two ideas that have never been combined before and making them into something that is brand new and really important. And you can't do that unless you have educated yourself both deeply and broadly. So I think that's one thing. And I also, in terms of my own personal reflection, I love to run, although it's getting harder as I get older. And I think some of my best thinking and personal reflection is when I'm sort of in that zone of just running someplace, enjoying nature, and you let your mind wander, and you can sometimes come up with either good ideas or good sort of self-reflection. And I think what it's all about is trying to strike a balance between your own fundamental deep-seated beliefs that you've grown up, in your own mind over time, and at the same time being able to handle new discovery that could add nuance to those views or even change them completely. And I liken it, because I've started oil painting. I liken it to first you lay down a base on the canvas, and then gradually over time you refine it and refine it and refine it into something that hopefully appeals to somebody who looks at it, or appeals to you personally as the artist that did it. And I think there's an analogy there in self-reflection of allowing your fundamental beliefs to grow over time, nuance based on what you learn from that broad and deep discovery.
Incredible analogies and incredible insights. And so as you approach as a leader, risk management, combined with decision making in these incredibly, I mean, you can't think of a more high pressure situation than everything you described in your career. Flying these planes for the US Navy, landing on a carrier, it's just incredible. What tools, Admiral, what tools or framework do you use to guide those processes?
Well, I think there are sort of two types of processes we're talking about. One is operational and the other is strategic. And for operational risk, management, there's a pretty solid process there that's well known. In fact, businesses use enterprise risk management, where you would identify that risk, and then you evaluate ways to mitigate that risk, and then you look at something called residual risk. And if that residual risk is acceptable, then you can proceed, whether it's a military operation or a business decision or what have you. And if it's not acceptable, then you either don't proceed or you have to go back and do new mitigations. And that's a very healthy process. I think the most difficult part of that process, frankly, is actually identifying the risks, because there are a lot of, black swans and gray rhinos and that sort of thing out there. You have to exercise a little imagination to find those things. On the strategic side, the thing that I find myself doing, forcing myself to do, is to ensure that any strategic decisions I make are not based wholly on instinct or wholly on data, but they're based on fundamental principles. And what I think is really useful as a leader, as a decision maker, is in a particular topic area, to have sort of a list of fundamental principles in your head. And that not only helps you make decisions, but if somebody ever asks you to stand up and talk about it, you can actually extemporaneously just go down that list in your mind. And there are a number of them. The one that is most strategic for me is a list of abstract and prioritized national security interests when you're trying to make decisions on use of national instruments of power, whether it be force or diplomacy or economics or information. And if you have that abstract and enduring list, and you can cast a particular situation, whatever it's Libya or Ukraine or China, against that list to find the intersections. And are the intersections high on those interests? Are there frequent interactions with those interests? And are the interactions very deep? A correlation starts to emerge that's either strong or weak. And where there's strong correlation, you're going to be more willing to use those instruments of power. And where the correlation is weak, you're not. And I think in our nation's history, we haven't always had a process like that. Usually when there's a crisis, it's like, what are our options? Rather than reverting to those sort of fundamental things. And I do that in a lot of other areas of life when I'm trying to make a strategic decision. So, and that takes advanced work. You don't make those principles up. When the situation occurs, you kind of have to have them in your head already, which is, I think, the job of a strategic leader.
That's a profound way to make a decision. And so these principles remain the same, right? Once you identify those principles, that's your North Star.
You're right.
And
they're abstract.
They're abstract, but they're there, and it's kind of like the golf analogy, where you can see the pin. It may be windy, it may be raining, maybe foggy even, but you can typically see the pin. You want to know where that pin is. You want to be heading in that direction. Now, there may be data points, how far, for example, you can hit a certain club or whatever it may be, but the principles remain the same. You're trying to get to the pin. Would that be right?
It is. It is there, and some of those principles are, what am I good at and what am I not good at? Another principle is what obstacles has the golf course designer put in front of me that's trying to lure me into doing something stupid here, putting your own reality versus the reality of the course is a good example there. But I think it's important in other types of strategic decisions for those principles to be abstract. Because if they're abstract, you can't make up the decision as you go along. You have to, you're always stuck with the discipline of relying on those principles to guide you to the North Star. And it helps keep you from making frivolous or unwise decisions if you have that. And it also helps you explain your decisions as well. It's like, hey, here's why I'm doing this. Let me talk about my principles here.
Incredible. And, I'm just so awestruck by this conversation and your leadership and your principles around the leadership. Admiral, do you have a final call to action for our global audience? And most importantly, where can we find Sailing Upwind, your new book?
Well, thanks for asking that. As far as a final call goes, something that I have always tried to train young people and people who work for me is try to put yourself in a position where you can think for yourself. Don't let other people think for you. And in this, politically divided world where people are yelling at you on social media or on TV or whatever, trying to tell you what you should be thinking, I think it's really important that you develop the beliefs and as we were talking about a moment ago, the principles that govern your own thinking. And that you listen, what are both sides of this issue saying here? So I can understand what makes sense to me against the backdrop of my own personal principles. And then have the courage to make that decision, even if it may not be exactly what your friends or your peers might be talking about at a cocktail party. You don't necessarily have to, challenge them openly on that, but you can be quiet. And it's like, hey, I don't really believe this stuff anymore. And I think this is the way we should be heading here. So I think, again, the call to action is think for yourself. Develop the skills and the knowledge that you need constantly. It's a constant journey to think for yourself. As far as the book goes, I do have a copy here. I will hold it up so people can see it. It's an ugly picture of me, but it is entitled Sailing Upwind, and you can find it at any normal bookseller, whether it's Barnes and Noble or Amazon or Books A Million. It's also available at the U.S. Naval Institute because that's who published the book, and it was a great joy to write. And I do hope that people find it both humble and also entertaining, but also educational in terms of how to think about leadership in a framework sense.
Admiral James Sandy Winnefeld, author, Sailing Upwind. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your inspiration. And most importantly, thank you for your service to our nation. Thank you so much.
Well, George, it's been a pleasure. Great questions. And thank you very much for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
It's an honor. Thank you.